This is Mr. Mitchell, and we have a new 9 weeks, and for some reason I just don't quite feel the same. Whether I feel the same or not, we can still watch some science videos. First science video we're going to talk about of this new 9 weeks is going to be about erosion. You see what the erosion is. It's the process of weathered particles being moved from one place to another. Now you may remember that weathering means that you have a breaking down of rocks. So when you have erosion, you have this soil that come from rocks, and you have these rocks that are being moved from one place to another. Now there's this other term that we need to talk about here called deposition. Now that comes from the word deposit. And what happens whenever this erosion takes place and it takes these rock and soil particles away, it has to deposit it somewhere. That's where sediments are placed in a new location. Well, anyway, let's take a look at some examples of erosion. Erosion can come primarily in the form of wind, water, and ice. Here's an example of where wind has taken away the particles of the particles of this side of the mountain, this soil that has been there, and it's over the years just actually formed some nice looking formations here. But that soil has to be deposited. The deposition of the soil has to be somewhere. Same thing has happened here. Wind has kind of created this shape. We mentioned that water can also may have mass amounts of erosion. And here's an example here. Here's a river that has literally formed this canyon. Now this reminds me of the Grand Canyon. This doesn't look like the Grand Canyon right here, but this may still be the Colorado River that will form into the Grand Canyon. And you can see this river, you might not can tell, but it's quite a raging river down through here. And over the years it has really torn up all the rocks that was in this area right here. Here's another form of water erosion, you might say. You can see these holes that are in these big rocks. It has to come from the waves. I mean, the constant collision of the waves upon the embankment has just over the years created some gaps there. I mentioned that ice can also form erosion. Now take a look here. We have this glacier that's on the top of this mountain. Glacier, of course, is packed down snow and ice. And you can see here that there is this groove that seems to be coming from the top of the mountain. This whole area here, a glacier, has apparently slid down at some point and taken these huge chunks of rock and soil and dirt out of the mountain. You can see this particular glacier right here may at some point travel the same exact path. So that's three ways you can have erosion: wind, water, and ice. Another form of erosion, or I guess kind of a large scale form of erosion, is something called mass wasting. Mass wasting is the downhill movement of masses of rock and soil. Now we're talking about like rock slides and mudslides, and they're usually triggered by an event such as an earthquake or heavy rain. But there's another event we'll talk about, especially with mudslides, here in just a little bit. Here's an example of a rock slide. And you can see this. We have this hill or mountain that is off to the left here, and something triggered all these rocks falling down. And once you kind of get rocks falling down, they kind of take other things like rocks with them. And fortunately it doesn't look like there were any cars there when this rock slide came down, but you can imagine how dangerous that would happen to be. Here's an example of a mudslide that did get a car. Now, one thing to note on this mudslide here is that you have this mountain which is in the background. Now, this mountain is the reason why you had the mudslide, because some kind of heavy rain was pounding the top of the mountain and ended up taking some of the mud, some of the dirt, and just kind of kept going, you might say. It took a lot of mud with it. And mudslides can be quite dangerous if you get the mud flowing. Mudslides are common after volcanic eruptions. Why? Well, because volcanoes often have snow on their peaks. Eruption's going to bring hot lava. The snow melts, And when the snow melts, all that water has to go somewhere, and it rushes down the side of the volcano. And as it rushes down, it picks up soil as it's going that way. A couple of slow forms of mass wasting have to do with slumps and creeps. Now, slump is an example like this. You can see here we have this side of a little hill, and you have exactly the same thing that happened in a larger form of mass wasting, except it took a long time. This little edge of the hill just kind of slumped down. You can imagine somebody who is slumping their shoulders. That's kind of how this would look. It just kind of slowly falls down because of gravity. Here's another example of it. Kind of the same thing happened, and over the years, grass started growing up in the gaps there. Now, an example of creep is in this fence line. Now take a look at this fence line here. It wasn't just knocked over because you have almost all the fence poles that are leaning. What has happened here, this hill has the top portion of the soil that is slowly moving downward because of gravity, but the soil underneath it, under the ground, a foot or more under the ground, is staying put. So what happens when the top portion of this soil of this hill goes that way, it's going to lean anything that's sticking with it. And that's exactly what's happened to this fence row here. And as you're traveling through the country, it's not that uncommon to see fences that are leaning just a little bit because they happen to be on the side of a hill, and you have creep